The second the Second Great Awakening occurred in New England around the same time as the Western movement. And so out in the West, you have the camp meetings. The second ring, you have New England. But New England, a lot of the revivalism is not occurring out in the outskirts of society, but sometimes in the very central part of civilized society itself. And so the revivalism in places like Yale College, and eventually Harvard College as well, would see a lot of revivalism among ministry students, right? Because Harvard and Yale, and even Princeton, these are schools that are training ministers still at this point. These are not, you could get a general degree, but it's mostly focused on preparing people to be preachers. A lot of the impulse at Yale, especially, was under the leadership of a man named Timothy Dwight. He was the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. Right? So he kind of grows up with this revivalist heritage. In addition, his great-great-grandfather, Solomon Stoddard, who was the grandfather of Jonathan Edwards, had also kind of set the stage for the Halfway Covenant and some other things that had kind of set the stage for the revivalism of the 1700s. Dwight had graduated from Yale, eventually becomes a chaplain during the Revolutionary War, also wrote a few hymns. His most famous is I Love Thy Kingdom, Lord, which we sang in chapel before spring break. And eventually he works his way into becoming president of Yale College. And one of the things he becomes concerned about is that in his student body, he sees a lot of ministers who aren't really connected as well to historic Christianity as he thinks they should be. Because remember, we talked about in the 18th century the rise of Unitarianism. People that believed that Jesus wasn't God in human form. And so this is very disturbing to Dwight. So he begins a series of chapel talks defending Christianity, the nature of Christianity, the moral implications of Christianity, trying to sway this Unitarian tide he sees at Yale. It takes 6 years of chapel talks, but eventually he starts to see this huge revival among his students. And a third of the students will eventually claim conversion, even though they're ministry students, right? They're claiming they finally having this conversion experience. And these revivals would continue to cascade for several years under Dwight's presidency. This revivalism wasn't just limited to Yale, because as these students would experience this conversion, experience the revival in Yale, they would then take it out to the different churches where they were settled as ministers. A good example of this is a man named Brian Beecher. He had studied with Dwight while Dwight was still a tutor at Yale before he became president. In fact, Dwight had been the one that had led him to a conversion and encouraged him to be a minister. He graduated in 1797, but was still connected to Dwight and still connected to the college. And when he starts hearing of these revivals that are hitting Yale, he wants to see them elsewhere as well. And so throughout the New England area, Beecher becomes very involved in trying to spread revivals in these churches as well. But especially for Beecher, he reflects this notion that we talked about when we were talking about culture and society of, this importance of attaching Christianity to social reform. And so he was involved in the temperance movement, trying to restrain alcohol, slavery as well. Right? Lyman Beecher is the father of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who we talked about as well. But he was really well known for his attempts to try to get rid of dueling. People, deciding that they were angry with someone, and so they challenged them to a duel. Right? And so Beecher was very involved in the early 19th century in getting dueling prohibited. In New England, there are a couple of things that make it different than out west. First of all, you don't see as many anti-revivalists in the Yale revivals. And a lot of those people that would have been anti-revivalists in the 18th century, if they had been in the 18th century, would have been anti-revivalists, they're kind of brought into the revivalist camp because this is done in a very orderly, educated type of fashion, where out west there's not as much education going on. The Yale revivals inspired other college revivals, eventually Harvard and some other places as well, and the students go out spreading the revivals in other places as they become settled ministers. The third front of the Second Great Awakening is the Mid-Atlantic states, or also the Old Northwest. The Old Northwest here would refer to places like Ohio, what would become Michigan, Wisconsin, some places like that, which are gradually becoming a part of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase. The key figure in this wing of the revivalism is a man named Charles Finney. Finney was born in Connecticut, but grew up in central New York, and eventually becomes a lawyer in the late 18-teens. But in his memoirs, he would describe his character as being very worldly. He saw himself as very sinful, despite growing up religious. And so he's kind of looking at his life here in his 20s, and kind of wanting to turn from that and wanting a conversion experience. But he never seems to find himself achieving this conversion experience that he hears other people talking about. It's eventually out in Meta, while he's reading his Bible, that he comes to this powerful feeling of the Holy Spirit upon him. And he realizes, and this is what he would later claim, that instead of waiting for God to do something to him, that he himself needed to use his own effort to give up his worldliness and accept conversion. That he was here to go waiting for God to do something, when he comes to the conclusion that it is God who's waiting for Finney to act. In doing that, he believes he has this conversion experience and decides to give up being a lawyer and become a minister. And so shortly after that, he passes a deacon of a local church who had hired him for some legal services. And he says to him, "Deacon, I have a retainer from the Lord Jesus Christ to plead his cause. I cannot plead yours." Right? And so I'm getting out of the law. God has made me his lawyer. And so Finney goes through several states and becomes very successful bringing about revival. He would later become president of Oberlin College in Ohio, which is a center of abolitionist thought. But he was also on the forefront of a couple other things as well. He would admit women to Oberlin College, which was unusual for colleges at the time. He would also admit African Americans to study at Oberlin, which also was unusual, even in the North. Part of his success appears to be a variety of practices that he incorporated into his ministry that are often referred to as new measures. These were new approaches, new techniques that hadn't been used that often before. But Finney kind of comes to the conclusion that these were things that were important. Let me give you a couple of examples. First was the greater incorporation of women into the services, especially to offer their conversion experiences. We've talked about before that as women, of course, converted in higher numbers to these different denominations, they would often have to recount their conversion experience to the minister, who then in the service would relate that conversion experience, and then the church would decide whether to admit the woman or not. Finney bypasses all that and allows the women to speak in these services and tell their conversion narratives. doesn't allow them to preach. We're not talking about ordination, although women will start to be ordained in some Christian groups as early as the 1850s. But this idea of women speaking in public, in religious services, was one thing that Finney brought in. Having long meetings in an urban setting, where you would go for 3 to 4 days or even up to several weeks. And there was one thing that happened outside in a camp meeting, but in an urban revival, in the cities where Finney is preaching, that was quite unusual. He would call out the wicked, right? The people he believed were wicked during his services, right? Address them by name instead of just kind of refer to the wicked. Right? He would call people. He would say "you" when speaking of the wicked. And perhaps one of the measures that Finney introduces that is the most successful and the most prolonged is what's known as the anxious bench. Now, before this time, there doesn't seem to have been a part of the service where, a part of Christian services where people were invited to come down to the front of whatever area was being used, the church building, the meeting hall, and to pray for their salvation, to look for their salvation. But he introduces what's known as the anxious bench, where he calls people down front who want to experience conversion, for them to pray to the point where they experience salvation. And so essentially, kind of instituting an invitation that hadn't been around in Christianity. In a sense, people had been encouraging people, inviting people to conversion, but this idea of a part of the service calling people to the front was something new that Finney introduced here in the 19th century. And of course, it's become a big hallmark of revivalism since then. Revivalists in the 19th, 20th, and even 21st century frequently at the end of the services call people down, right? And if it's like Billy Graham in this huge football stadium, right? Calling people down to the football stadium, to the turf. This idea of this anxious venture, this place where you can go and pray for salvation. Essentially what Finney is doing here is emphasizing the abilities of human beings to begin and spread revivals. To this point, revivals were looked upon by people as it's the Spirit of God moving, and you never know when it's going to come. Right? It's just going to appear. But Finney believed that there were certain efforts, certain measures, certain activities people could do to bring about revivals. And that God would bless that by sending the Spirit, but that you didn't have to wait for the Spirit to show up. God was looking for you to act first, and then the Spirit would show up. And so we have this kind of great emotionalism, the spirit of revivalism, a lot of things that we still see in Christianity today coming out of this 19th century Second Great Awakening. What questions, comments do you have at this point? Anything that I can clarify? Let's move then from talking about the revivalism in the 19th century to talking about new music styles. And certainly we will see here from the 1800s on, and really even the 18th century on, these new music styles developing that are shaping how Christians practice their religion. Right? And so there's kind of this symbiotic relationship between the practice of Christianity, the doctrine of Christianity, and music. Music is reflecting the doctrines of the time, but music also ends up shaping the doctrines of the time. Right? And so it's kind of this kind of back and forth. And it's really with the 18th century that you see these new styles of music. And as with the 18th century, and Isaac Watts and all the opposition he faced, a lot of these new styles, up through even the 21st century, will, as they are introduced, face more and more opposition. People not liking the particular style, how things are done, how things are sung. Now, that reminds us here of how a lot of the things that we consider the standards or the classics today right? The songs of Isaac Watts, the hymns that we'll talk about here in a little bit of Fannie J. Crosby. Right? These are kind of the standards, the classics. And if you don't sing those, you're introducing this new music. No, at the time these were introduced, they were new music and faced opposition. Right? So this isn't something unusual, but this idea of somehow these are better than the newer ones reflects this kind of historical amnesia. They were new at one point. But before talking about some of those newer songs that are going on in the 19th century, I want to talk about some things that are going on among slave groups. And so one new type of Christian music in the 19th century is the spiritual. Now, originally the spiritual was a form of music for African American Christians, but it gradually makes its way into white hymnody as well, as whites will gradually pick up some of these songs, and many of which appear in standard hymn books today. Often the spirituals were a combination of the European theology that slaves were hearing, as well as African rhythms and body movements, right? So it's kind of this melding of what they're hearing from the whites and what they're bringing over from their African traditions. A lot of the spirituals, even those that had kind of this first person, right, singing about what I've felt or I've done, right, nobody knows the trouble I've seen, even though they were kind of very personal and first person, they were meant to be sung communally. They were to be sung together. And often involved body movement, hand clapping, feet stomping, which may have arisen from the ring shouts of African tribes. These ritual dances which involve moving in a circle, clapping, singing. And often these communal singings would lead to this spontaneous prayers, spontaneous songs, and so it was much less rigorous form. These spirituals might show up in a variety of places. They might show up in slave services where the white masters are watching. But they were prominent in the services that slaves would have, that we'll talk about more here in a minute. But the spirituals developing in the 19th century were very heavily symbolic. They drew on biblical themes and people. It's songs about heroes of faith who had been tested. The sufferings of Jesus. One of the prominent themes out of that was the Exodus, right? This notion of going to Canaan's land, going to the Promised Land, the pitting of Moses against Pharaoh, right? And so these are the kind of themes that work their way into the spirituals. Often the spirituals were in code. They were coded protests, and so they could be singing under the nose of the white master about how terrible the conditions were, how they hated the conditions, but because of the way that the symbols were used, the white master has no clue what's going on. There could also be coded messages of escape or secret meetings. Like you might be singing about steal away to Jesus, and the master thinks, okay, I've got these good Christian slaves, but what one slave is telling the other is there's a secret meeting tonight. And so they're right under the nose of the taskmaster. If you look back at the spirituals, there's a variety of emotions that are expressed in there. Certainly sadness, expectations, loneliness, but also triumph, and the hope of triumph, the hope of deliverance. All of these things wrapped up in the emotional experience, which reflects a larger part of slave religion as well. So I'm going to take a little sidetrack here and talk about slave religion in general, and then we'll come back to music. We've talked about slave religion before in a variety of circumstances, the politics, the culture, and society. But we're not thinking about just the practice of the slaves. The planters, these people that are owning slaves, have endeavored to destroy the communal practices of African traditional religions. They did not want to see those continue. And they were very successful in some cases throughout the 18th century, even into the 19th century. But by the time slave families started, and we talked about this with the politics of the importation of female slaves and kind of this self-perpetuating workforce, some of those practices gradually returned, although they were often integrated with Christianity. And so while many of these slaves participated in traditional white denominations or in new black denominations like we talk about, they often had their own religious practices, which has often been referred to by scholars as an invisible institution. The practice of the slaves at night, in secret, away from their masters. And here, these places were, and these types of practices were often the hybrid practices. And so you have the development group of practices like Century and Candomblé that we talked about, this kind of combination of Catholicism and African, mostly European traditions. But then also a lot of slaves, of course, injected these things into Christianity, thought of themselves as Christians, but integrated some of these African practices. I mean, think about it. Slave masters, through preachers, through a variety of other types of things, are trying to force and control the message. Right? Even black preachers, as they're publicly preaching, have to preach a message of don't steal, don't lie, obey your masters. You know, they try to put all these laws against meeting in secret. But in the invisible institution, slaves were able to express their own Christianity. Right? They were able to make it their own. And it, too, reflects this idea of speaking in code. There's the use of languages of, for example, Exodus, and some of this would even be in the sermons that the black preachers are preaching in front of the white masters. And so you're preaching about Canaan's land, but what you're really saying is something about the road to freedom or escape, or a secret meaning. All these kind of things to kind of express amongst yourselves a religious viewpoint, a Christian viewpoint, that you've adopted that is actually running counter to what your white masters are teaching. And all of that, of course, wrapped up with the spirituals as being one of the ways that this is being done.